Hello fellow readers, book lovers, and whoever else is watching this. I'm Emily at Midnight. Welcome to my channel. Lately I've been reading a lot of mysteries and thrillers, and even a few horror books. And at the same time, my husband and I have been getting into watching horror films. And the combination of these two is the impetus for this video. Recently, my husband and I watched The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is an American Gothic horror miniseries that was released to Netflix in 2020. We loved this series so much. We loved it so much. It was so fun. There were a lot of things that were really cool, and some things that were a little bit, like, it felt a little bit loose in the story, but overall, what we watched of it, we loved so much that we found ourselves talking about it for weeks after we watched it. As we continued to talk about this story, what we liked, what we didn't like, looking into the history of the story, we discovered that it was based on a book called The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and was published in 1898. Now, being a bookish girly, and discovering that this story we really loved originally came from a book, obviously I had to read it. So I decided to pick up the book, and then I was going to compare the book and the TV series and decide which one I thought did what better. But in the process of talking about this and researching it, I discovered that there was actually another movie made based on this book in the same year as The Haunting of Bly Manor. In 2020, we got The Haunting of Bly Manor, and we also got The Turning. Now, there have been a ton of adaptations of this story by Henry James. I'm not exactly sure why. It is a great story, but there's a lot of good stories out there, but there have been so many good movies made off of this book. However, there was something about the fact that this movie came out the same year as the TV show that really just got me hooked. And so I ended up watching that with my husband as well. So the movie kind of got wrapped into this as well. So I'm going to be talking about the book, The Turn of the Screw, the TV show, The Haunting of Bly Manor, and the movie, The Turning, both released in 2020. Let's talk about what I liked about them, what I didn't, how they took the story and did different things with it, and ultimately what my thoughts were. I'm going to start out with a spoiler-free description of the setting and the premise, and then I will let you know when the spoilers are coming so you can skip ahead if you're planning on reading or watching any of these stories. So let's get started. And obviously we have to start with the book, because that's the origin of this gothic horror tale. The story starts at a Christmas gathering. From what I understand, it's a group of strangers who have all gone on holiday at the same time for Christmas and have met up in a hotel of sorts. One of the random things that I love about this book is that it touches on one of my favorite random forgotten traditions. In Victorian England, Christmas was a social time, not a family time, and they specifically gathered together to tell scary stories. This isn't a thing we do anymore. It's very much gone from our traditions, especially in North American culture. Christmas is now very much a family and religious time, but you can still catch traces of this tradition in the lyrics of carols like "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year," with lines like "There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago." So yes, this story is set in England at Christmas time, sometime before 1898. And our travelers gather in their hotel of sorts and get together in the evenings to tell ghost stories around the fire. And it is on one of these nights that our narrator, Douglas, tells the group that he has a scary ghost story of his own to tell. It's a story told to him years ago by a woman he fell in love with, and it's a story that happened to her. Then he dives into our main story. I'm not sure why we have storyception here, but we do. So the story is about a woman who takes a job in a manor in Essex called Bly. She agrees to be a governess for two children, Miles and Flora, whose parents have died, but so have a few other people in their lives as well. People who might still be trying to communicate with them. But we'll get into that in the spoiler section. Now for the miniseries. How does it differ from the book? Well, the first difference is in the setting for the outer layer of our storyception, our story onion, one might say.
Onions have layers. Ogres have layers.
The TV series takes place in modern day, so it doesn't take place at Christmas, surprise, surprise, since we don't tell scary ghost stories at Christmas anymore. But it's in a wedding. In America, and it's like the evening before the wedding at the rehearsal dinner. I was a little bit confused by this since, we don't really tell ghost stories at weddings either, but they had to set it somewhere, I guess. The reason that they get into the ghost stories is because the wedding is set in this beautiful old home in California, I think, and it's said that this old home is haunted, and that gets them talking about ghosts. Now, in the miniseries, our narrator is not Douglas. It's actually an older English woman who we don't know her connection to the story until the very end. She tells a story that is very similar in premise to Douglas's story. A woman, this time an American woman, goes to take a job in Essex at a manor called Bly, where she'll be the nanny of 2 children, Miles and Flora, whose parents have died, and maybe a few other people in their lives as well. The 2020 movie, The Turning, on the other hand, skips the outer layer of our storyception altogether. It dives right in with the woman taking the job as a private tutor for one little girl at a manor in Essex called Bly. She's been assigned a one-on-one live-in tutor position. It takes place in 1994 in some vague place, which I have to assume is in America, since almost everyone in the cast has an American accent. It was fascinating to me how the story in the movie followed the book very closely, but took it in a very different direction from The Haunting of Bly Manor. But more on that in the spoiler section. Now let's get on to the actual plot. It's a horror story, so I really can't tell you that much without giving away the story. So for those of you that want to watch the miniseries or the 2020 movie The Turning, go ahead and skip ahead to this timestamp so you won't have anything spoiled for you. You might notice that I didn't mention skipping ahead to skip the spoilers if you wanted to read the book, just the 2 adaptations. And that's because the book is pretty short and not as interesting. And I personally didn't find that knowing the general story took anything away from the reading experience. But you know, if you want to avoid spoilers for reading the book, then you can skip ahead for that reason too, I guess. So let's dive into the story, spoilers and all. So let's get into the book. The story follows the governess, who for some reason is unnamed. Now, why we get a name for Douglas, who is pretty unimportant to the story, just a general narrator, and not a name for our main character, the governess, who goes around taking care of the children and seeing ghosts. I don't know, but I bet it rhymes with smishmogeny. She does have a name in the TV series, though, and that is Danny. So that's what I'm going to be calling our dear governess. The story starts out with Danny taking the role as the governess, which was offered to her by the children's uncle, Henry Wingrave. Once there, Danny meets the younger of the 2 children, Flora, and also the housekeeper named Miss Gross. Very soon after, the older of the 2 children, Miles, comes home from boarding school. Now, he came home unexpectedly and early, and it turns out that he was sent home, basically expelled for bad behavior, unspecified bad behavior. Now, this is a bit of a problem for Danny and Miss Gross, since they can't figure out anything that Miles could have done wrong. He's a perfectly well-mannered and kind child as far as they can tell. What could he possibly have done to get himself kicked out of boarding school? Now, soon enough, Danny catches sight of a person, a man, on Bly Manor grounds who she doesn't recognize. Voila! She immediately tells Mrs. Gross about him and gives her the description. And upon hearing the description, Mrs. Gross says that he sounds exactly like Peter Quill. Peter Quint, a man who was once employed by their uncle as a valet. He was a rude person who acted like he owned the place when the uncle wasn't around. But more importantly, he's dead. Upon discovery that this intruder matches the description of this man quite perfectly, Danny and Mrs. Gross jump to the place being haunted by him much more quickly than I personally think I would. But Peter Quint isn't the only lurker. On another day, when out on the grounds with Flora, Danny spots yet another person. A woman this time, seen lurking across the pond. The most unnerving part about this encounter isn't the stranger across the pond, but the fact that Flora very obviously saw her and is trying to hide the fact that she saw the woman across the pond from Danny. Danny tells Mrs. Gross about this event, and again they connect the dots and the descriptions and identify this woman as Miss Jessel, the children's last governess, and a woman who had been taken in by Peter Quint. He had seduced her, and together they ruled Bly Manor anytime the uncle was away. Miss Jessel would care for Flora, and Peter Quint would spend all of his time with Miles, teaching him in his ways. Miss Gross is sure that it was his influence, Peter Quint's influence on Miles, that got Miles to act up at school such that he got expelled. One more very vital piece of information in this puzzle is that Miss Jessel is also dead. Miss Jessel is known to have offed herself while living at Bly, though no one is quite sure why. And this happened just before Quint was found dead. Danny and Mrs. Gross are distressed. They're coming up with plan after plan to try and keep the children safe from these ghosts, but Danny keeps spotting the ghosts near the children. After much ado and several creepy run-ins, including a time where it seemed that Miles went outside to meet with Peter Quint, the ghost. Though Miles says that it was simply to show his governess that that he could be naughty if he wanted to. After all of that, it becomes incredibly clear to Danny that she must contact their uncle and tell him what is going on with the children. Now, important context is that Mr. Wingrave, the uncle, specifically told Danny never to contact him about the children, not for anything. But she has decided that the situation is dire enough, she must write to him, so she does. But before the letter can be delivered, it disappears, and they discover that Miles has taken it. This is the event that brings everything to a head. Danny opts to send Mrs. Gross away with Flora to keep them safe, and she confronts Miles herself. He eventually does admit to taking the letter, but can't seem to give her a reason for why he did it. Just then, Danny sees Quint out the window and tries to shield Miles from him with her body. Miles calls out for Quint, and Danny grabs him, trying to shield him from him once again, only for his lifeless body to fall limp in her arms. And that, my friends, is the book. It's eerie and dark, but it's also left somewhat ambiguous. More ambiguous than you might think. You see, Miss Gross never actually sees the ghosts. She just hears about them from Danny. In fact, neither of the children actually fully admit to seeing the ghosts either, so we can only be 100% certain that the governess saw the ghosts. This leaves open the possibility that only Danny was haunted, or that there were no ghosts at all. It's possible that in the end, Miles dies of natural causes, or that a delusional Danny smothered him herself and is an unreliable narrator. I personally don't buy into that narrative. I like the more plain interpretation because it's supernatural and very creepy, and because the more literal interpretation was taken by the miniseries, which I watched before I read or watched anything else on the subject. I'm a little influenced that way, but I think that both interpretations are pretty interesting, and I really love a story that leaves it just open-ended enough that you could argue one way or another. One more thing about the book. It was very definitely written in the 1800s. The late 1800s, but the 1800s just the same. It is very, very telly on the show versus tell spectrum, and it makes it a lot less fun to read than more modern thrillers. But I enjoyed it well enough. There's no reason not to give it 4 stars. And with that, well, it's time to talk about the miniseries from 2020, The Haunting of Bly Manor. Compared to the book, how does it stack up? Well, for starters, the book is considered a short story, and the TV series is a miniseries with 9 episodes, both roughly 50 minutes long. So they've clearly drawn out the story some. The storyception aspect takes place in the modern day, as I explained, but the haunting part of the story takes place a few decades before that. They don't say specifically, but it's giving the 80s. The story taking place in a modern time didn't affect the story that much, but there was one aspect that made me a little bit curious. In the series, Peter Quint not only seduced Miss Jessel, but also convinced her to help him defraud the uncle Henry Wingrave. He wanted her to help him steal all of his money and run away together. But the part that confuses me about this is that Miss Jessel is highly educated. I think she has a law degree, and she ended up deciding to work for Henry Wingrave because he said something about giving her an internship or a job or something if she just took care of the kids for a certain amount of time for him. Now, Quint convinces her that this was all a lie. And honestly, it could be. It sounds a little bit sketchy to me. But the way that he convinces her of this is by telling her that they are both lower class and always will be. The upper class will never let them succeed through honest hard work because they need to keep the classes divided to keep their high status. Now, okay, wealth inequality has existed for basically as long as written history has, and probably before that, so I don't have a problem with that. But Quint really makes it sound like 1980s England is like still living in a society with lords and peasants and this feudal society. I've been told that his perception is actually at least a little bit accurate, and that there is still a major class divide in English, which could totally be true. I don't know. I've never been to England and I wasn't alive in the 80s, so I can't say one way or another. But this part of the story definitely felt like they were talking about it being longer ago than the setting actually was. I could just be totally wrong about this, but it felt a little weird to me. But let's talk about other major differences in the miniseries as compared to the book. For starters, there's an expanded cast. This is roughly all of the people that exist in the book, but in the TV series, we have more people who work at Bly Manor. We have, of course, Danny, who serves as the nanny, and we have Miss Gross, the housekeeper. But we also have Owen, who is the biggest sweetheart in the world and is the cook and occasional chauffeur, and we have Jessie, the gardener. The root of the story, as I said, is very similar, but there is a lot more going on in the miniseries. For starters, Quint and Miss Jessel are not the only ghosts, not by far. This is one of the ways that they added to the story that just worked so well. There is a greater evil beyond these two ghosts that lurks in the bottom of the lake at Bly. This evil is in the form of the Lady of the Lake, who maybe I should have put on the board, but I didn't. There's actually nearly an entire episode dedicated to her. She was dying, probably of tuberculosis.
Everything is about tuberculosis.
In the 1600s, and her husband and her sister were having an affair. She dies so full of anger and hate that she manages to stick around to get her revenge. There's this visually stunning scene where she possesses a trunk of her things that were left to her daughter, waiting patiently for the day that her sister grows greedy enough to take her dresses and jewels for herself, and strangles her. Through the centuries, the Lady of the Lake lingers at Bly, taking occasional walks through the manor and grounds, looking for her daughter, who her husband took away when he moved away, after, a possessed trunk unalived his second wife. There have been dozens of people who have met their end as she took her walks, people who were unfortunate enough to cross her path. And this list includes Peter Quint. It seems that anyone who is ended by a ghost at Bly Manor is doomed to haunt Bly forever. This new piece of background, the reason that Peter Quint and Miss Jessel haunt Bly, gave so much flavor and creep factor to the story. I loved it. I thought it was a really, really good addition. Although, unfortunately, I will say, it didn't feel that they really utilized this new piece of the story to its full potential. Early on in the show, we see hints of these ghosts before we ever see a hint of Peter Quint or the Lady of the Lake. But later in the series, it's revealed that the ghosts at Bly Manor slowly lose their identity and autonomy, and this is shown physically by them losing the details of their faces. And in fact, the only ghosts at Bly that seem to pose any danger to anyone are the Lady of the Lake and Peter Quint, who unalived Miss Jessel in his ghost form. This really felt like a letdown to me because, as I said, we see hints of these ghosts from early on. Flora is very aware of these ghosts. Flora specifically told Danny not to leave her room at night. And when Danny does inevitably do this, the ghosts that we see kind of in the background of shots aren't the Lady of the Lake. They're these other less important ghosts. Because the series gives you information just a little bit at a time, it really felt like any one of these ghosts could hurt Danny at any moment. But later we realized that Flora was really just worried about Danny crossing the Lady of the Lake's path. I just wanted so much more from the other ghosts. Like, if you're going to give me a house of ghosts, really give me a house full of ghosts. But the house full of ghosts really did give them a lot to work with when it came to Flora. Flora is at least a little bit creepy in the book, but in the miniseries, she really is something else entirely. From her excessively bright and cheerful persona that she's clearly putting on, to her calling literally everything perfectly splendid, to her having a doll of every person and ghost at Bly that she moves around in sync with the being they represent, to the little voodoo doll-esque charms that she makes to guard the manor. They really upped the creepy factor with her. But again, there were a couple of threads that were dropped without explanation that I wish had a little bit more follow through. Like, why did she make the charms? Why did they look the way that they did? We don't know. There's no explanation for anything about the charms. They're just kind of a creepy detail that gets dropped. There were also quite a few other ways that I felt the story was really built on that added a lot. First off, the dynamic between the characters is so rich, especially between the adults like Danny and Hannah Gross and Jesse and Owen. They have this really beautiful dynamic where they're all becoming friends. It feels very found family, and it's a nice soft cushion to land on as we're going through these spooky scenes in the miniseries. I think if you had a creepy show that was that long and didn't have this nice cushion to land on sometimes, it would get quite overwhelming, but instead it kept the show very alive. They also built on the boarding school detail with Miles and why he got expelled. See, Peter Quint did spend a lot of time with Miles and really did rub off on him, so much so that when he became a ghost, he was able to maintain this friendship and influence over the boy. He convinced Miles that when he went away to school, he would need to act up to get sent back home. He did this for reasons that we'll explain in just a little bit, but Miles follows this advice to a T. In fact, it doesn't work at first, but he keeps at it. Starting fights and jumping from trees for no reason isn't enough for the teachers to give up on him, but eventually he finds something unsettling enough to get sent home. See, one of the main teachers at the school had a pet dove. I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, and yes, that is where it's going. Miles unalives this dove in cold blood, practically right in front of the teacher. And in that moment, the teacher is finally disturbed enough to send him home and never invite him back to school. I felt that giving us a specific reason and giving us this reason of harming an animal for seemingly no reason at all really made the situation more unsettling than having no answer and just wondering. So I thought this was an excellent addition. This isn't the only way they add creep value to Miles, though. There are countless times in this series where he acts really bizarre, specifically knowing how to talk down to women in a way that a child shouldn't have been able to pick up on yet. Now, the reason he acts this weird is both more and less creepy than you think it is. See, Peter Quint has discovered that he can possess Miles. So every time Miles acts really weird, it's actually Peter Quint at the wheel. So yeah, that is definitely creepy. But I will say, Miles acting this creepy on his own certainly would have been just as terrifying. So the fact that it's actually Peter Quint both adds creepy and takes away creepy, if you know what I mean. One of the things that Quint did while controlling Miles specifically, though, definitely takes the cake. And it's just another way that the directors added layers upon layers of intrigue and brilliance to this story. And that is that he knocks Hannah Gross down a well at the beginning of the story. Now, you might be thinking, Emily, does that mean that Hannah Gross, Miss Gross, isn't that big of a character in this version of the story? The answer is no, because Hannah Gross is in denial about her death and goes about as if she were still alive. And you as the audience don't learn that she's actually a ghost until nearly the very end. And the way that they weave this throughout the story and place hints here and there is incredible. It's brilliant. It adds cost and heaviness to the story and also contributes greatly to the intrigue. It might be my favorite thing that they added to this whole story. Another big addition that I really felt added to the story is the reason that Miss Jessel and Peter Quint are after Miles and Flora. The ghosts of Bly seem to be tied specifically to Bly and can't leave the grounds. We also have that added information about the fact that ghosts slowly lose their identity and consciousness over time, something that Peter and Miss Jessel really don't want to have happen to them. But you see, Peter Quint has not yet given up on defrauding Henry Wingrave. He still plans to live out whatever life he can in wealth. His new plan involves permanently possessing Miles and Flora, having him possess Miles and Miss Jessel possess Flora, and in their bodies leave the property and live out privileged lives as Miles and Flora Wingrave. With this addition, there's something specific for Dani to be afraid of and protecting the children from when it comes to Peter Quint and Miss Jessel. She learns about the ghost's intentions as she overhears Peter Quint telling Miles the command that would give himself over for full and permanent possession. But before Quint can take over, and before Dani can get the kids away to safety, and in all of that chaos, Flora accidentally crosses the path of the Lady of the Lake, who is still looking for her missing daughter. The Lady of the Lake scoops Flora up and heads back towards the lake. Just before she brings Flora under the surface of the water, Dani calls out the command she heard Quint give to Miles and offers herself up to the Lady of the Lake. This moment really sealed the deal for me, because the Lady of the Lake had been added as background and explanation for the ghosts and why they're at Bly, but this event tied her into the danger and the solution of the story as well. The Lady of the Lake does possess Dani, and in doing so, she releases the force that pinned all the ghosts to Bly, thus saving the children from Peter Quint and Miss Jessel's influence. Surprisingly, the lady seems to be willing to be a passive possessor for a while, simply living through Dani away from Bly for many years. But eventually she does take over and claims Dani's life in the very lake she once possessed. Nevertheless, it seems the pairing of Dani and the Lady of the Lake together has released Bly from the curse that once held people there after passing. Oh, I almost forgot. It's actually revealed that the old lady at the beginning of the story, the outer layer of our story onion, the woman who was a guest to a wedding, was Jessie the gardener in her old age, who had fallen in love with and married Dani, but eventually lost her to the Lady of the Lake. As far as adding explanations to unexplained forces can ever add to a horror story, I really felt that this was not only tied in well, but added layers to the story without creating any plot holes in the process. But as much as that was added and did not create issues, I do have to point out the times when things were added and did create issues. And unfortunately, there were quite a few times where something didn't feel like it quite fit, or took away from the story, or just wasn't tied in well. So let's get into it. The first one is so disappointing to me. So one of the creepiest things about the story at the very beginning is Dani's fiance. Yes, she has a fiance. You didn't know she had a fiance, because the way that he appears in the story, it's so creepy. Anytime she sees herself in a reflected surface, there's this shadow of a man with glowing eyes over her shoulder, and it is terrifying. Oh my gosh, I screamed the first time I saw it. And it's just, it's so haunting because it catches you at the most random moments anytime that like her reflection is shown. It's so interesting, and it follows you for the whole first half of the story, I think. Maybe just the first couple of episodes. And in many ways, it feels very tied in to what's going on. But unfortunately, this most creepy part of the beginning of the story doesn't tie into the rest of the story at all. We end up learning that it's her fiance, who was once her childhood friend, who she cares so much about. But just before the wedding, she realizes she wasn't actually in love with him. She just really cared for him and kind of went along as he pushed the relationship forward. She ends up sort of accidentally breaking this to him and breaking up with him, and he gets out of the car very frustrated and gets hit by a truck. So what we see are his glasses lighting up right before he gets hit, that she's reliving that memory over and over again. So basically, the scariest part of the beginning of the story is just PTSD. In fact, she ends up like confronting him and herself over all of this, and he just goes away partway through. Like, she's no longer haunted by him because he wasn't really there. It was kind of just internal for her. So it's very odd to have this like internal manifestation of PTSD when at the same time they also had real ghosts in the same story. It felt very out of place. It really felt like they changed their mind halfway through with what they were doing with him too, because there's this whole scene where Miles and Flora are on this staircase doing this play for them, and Miles is giving this soliloquy about being like a man on strings. The very end of that scene, right after this play, we see her fiance manifest physically in front of her, not in a reflection, for the very first time, and then he gets pulled away, and it looks like he got pulled away on strings. So you're like, oh my gosh, there's something going on. There's some force controlling all of these ghosts. But no, she just like does a little bit of self-therapizing, and then he's gone. And so what was the scene on the staircase? That play never ties into anything. What did the fiance have to do with anything? It was all very confusing. And this was honestly my biggest bone to pick with the series because it was so interesting. And then they just dropped it. They just decided, we're kind of done with that part of the story and pushed it aside. It wasn't connected at all. It was very odd to have that in there. Again, I loved it, but it was so frustrating because then it didn't tie in. I feel like that's probably why I was so frustrated at this, is because of how much I liked it. For it to go nowhere was very disappointing. There were a couple of other things as well. For example, Henry Wingrave has this like second, like this other half to him. It's like his evil twin, but it's still just him, and he talks to himself a whole bunch, mostly anytime he gets drunk. It's very odd and isn't tied in super well. I think it's interesting, but the way that it's not tied in makes it just feel odd instead of scary. Oh, there's another piece with Henry Wingrave actually, where it's revealed that he had an affair with his brother's wife and is actually probably the father of Flora. So they're like half siblings, not whole siblings, but like half cousins. It just really didn't add that much to me. There's also this whole thing with there being like a forbidden wing that they're not allowed to go down. And actually, oddly enough, there's a forbidden wing in the movie too, The Turning. But I swear there was not a forbidden wing in the book. Maybe I'm going crazy, but I really remember reading the book and being like, when are they going to get to the forbidden wing? There was no forbidden wing. But then both adaptations that I watched had a forbidden wing. I really feel like it has to come from the source material, but I don't think it does. So yes, I will say, some of the dropped threads, specifically the fiance one, but a couple of the other ones did disturb my viewing experience because they bothered me so much, but they didn't ruin the experience. It didn't disturb me enough to ruin the experience or anything. I still wildly enjoyed this series, and I think about it literally all the time. Now it's time to talk about the 2020 movie, The Turning. The movie pares the cast down considerably, as I have represented. The only characters are Danny, who in this version her name is Kate, Mrs. Gross, Miles, Flora, and the ghosts of Peter Quint and Miss Jessel. Like I said, the movie followed the book incredibly well, while also somehow telling a completely different story from the miniseries. The first thing that they did is paring down the story, paring down the cast. They actually kept the story a little bit more succinct than even the book did, especially by not having the story within the story. The second thing that they did was follow a specific interpretation of the book that The Haunting of Bly didn't use at all. That of implying that it might well be only the nanny who sees the ghosts, and that they are in fact probably in her head. And okay, I know I just said earlier in this video that I wasn't fond of that interpretation of the book, but when it's put on the screen in this way, when it's hinted at and then taken away and then hinted at again, just the way they did it, man, I loved it. It was so interesting to watch. The only other way that the movie deviates from the book that I need to keep on this side of the spoiler wall is that Miles is not unalived by Peter Quint, because the end of the story is a bit of a loop of stories, making it impossible to tell what is real or not. So the horror at the end of the story isn't about losing a child, but of losing reality itself. And again, I thought it was done really, really well. welcome back if you skipped the spoilers. I just got done explaining how the 2020 movie The Turning told the story differently from the book and the miniseries. I'm done discussing spoilers, but I do have a lot more to say when it comes to how the book, the movie, and the TV series told the same story. But before we get into that, I think it's important to discuss what makes a good adaptation. Oftentimes, we as readers throw out ideas like we want a movie to follow a book beat for beat, scene for scene, even though we know what we're asking for isn't actually that practical. And in an 1800s book like this, wouldn't actually be that fun. So what does make a good adaptation? Is it more important to have the factual details of the movie match the book exactly? Or is it better to add and change details and pieces of the narrative in a way that brings it closer to the tone and intention of the book? Or is it better to have a movie or TV show take light inspiration from a book, but then go in a completely different direction altogether, perhaps to preserve the sanctity of the story? There are a billion different answers to this question, but what I found while reading the book and watching the movie and TV series was that a good adaptation is one that follows or enhances the tone and feeling that the book brings. And this is probably also why we often end up disliking adaptations and also disagreeing on them, because everyone comes out of a book with a slightly different interpretation and feeling. If you've ever been in a book club, you know exactly what I mean. But that's also where we get some really incredible and unique stories based on the same book, but that are nothing alike, as is the case here. The director of The Haunting of Bly Manor, Mike Flanagan, and the director of The Turning, Floria Sigismondi, both saw something special in different aspects of the same story and brought those pieces forward in their adaptations. Mike Flanagan is a lover of telling ghost stories, and so he focused on the ghosts and built them up in his story. He also had more room to tell his story since the miniseries had a total of 8 hours and 25 minutes runtime. So he built on those characters and added in more characters and really created this rich tapestry to build his story on. He ended up having enough time to be able to add in a lot of aspects to his story, even so many that some of them felt a little unanchored to the original story and drove me a little bit crazy. So even though I loved the series, there were some aspects that kind of detracted from it, in my opinion. Floria Sigismondi, on the other hand, saw the psychological horror of the haunting and really focused in on that. She pared down a lot of the other details to focus in and ended up doing a lot with that part of the story. So is it better to draw things out, giving yourself room to build upon the story? Or is it better to pare things down to be able to keep to the utmost core of the story? When looking at this example specifically, the book was a pretty good starting place, but it was pretty bare bones and simple in itself. The Netflix miniseries rounded out the story with a lot of cool new details, but not all of them tied in very well. And the 2020 movie pared the story back and focused in on one specific interpretation and aspect. And ultimately, I don't think there's really a way to say objectively which version of the story is best. But that's why media and art are subjective. So what do I think? I think the book was fine, but I did want more from it. The miniseries was really just so good. I really loved the added details with the ghosts, the intrigue, the interest, the mystery of it all. There were some parts of the additions that really took away from the story, but not enough to lesser my overall enjoyment, just enough to really want to talk about it with someone. Thank you. The movie The Turning, on the other hand, told a completely different story. They added nothing. They pared things back, and in a way that ironically added a lot to the story by being able to dive into the depths of each of those moments. They told a very tight story that I had a lot of fun with and very few notes for. But while watching it, I did miss some of the aspects of what the miniseries had added to the story, especially some really fun characters. Basically what I'm saying is I really liked both adaptations. Like, a lot. And I think it's really cool when we have more than one to be able to compare the different ways that people tell the same story. How will you best enjoy this specific story? That's a great question, but I bet you can figure it out by matching your tastes to how I explained the focus of each story. Let me know which version you think would be the best in the comments below, and definitely give this story a try. And if you have read or watched any version of this story, please let me know in the comments below. I want to hear all of your thoughts. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I had so much fun scripting it, watching, reading, getting ready for this. It was a blast from start to finish. I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like and subscribe if you liked my video. Also, definitely check out my recent vlog. I toured all of the indie bookstores that I could in the Twin Cities, and it was a ton of fun. I'm also reading and explaining, reviewing The Wheel of Time as I'm reading it, and I'm reading Harry Potter for the first time as an adult and filming the experience. So definitely check out those two series as well. Feel free to follow my Goodreads, Instagram, Storygraph, etc., all of which are Emily at Midnight and are linked in the description below. Have a wonderful day, treat people with respect, and pick up a book. That our narrator, Douglas, is over here. Yes, I bet you were wondering what this is for. It's for the characters. Oh no! tragedy.